You
Sorry?
change nothing. You will change nothing with your activism. You will change nothing. You need innovation to change something.
Need what, sorry?
You need innovation to change something, to reduce the carbon footprint and so on. You need innovation because people don't want to reduce their life standards.
Content over everything!
So
yeah, so now we need to, okay. This is what I mean about activism uninformed by theory. If you're doing activism without looking at the theory, social theory, you could make a big mistake. For example, a lot of climate activists, a lot of environmental activists, they tell us that we need to live a life of much more frugality and not eating so much, consuming so less and so on. And I get what they're saying and it's good, but they may be giving people the wrong idea, all right? Because the fact is we have the technology and the innovation already to provide for everybody on the planet clothing, shelter, food, all the rest of it, many times over. Many times over. We have that potential. And by focusing on endlessly on individual lifestyle changes to strip that down, we could be forgetting that. Actually, we have the technology to look after everyone sustainably, ecologically.
Yeah.
It's there. So I don't believe in like a scarcity mindset. In my ecology, I try and hold out the possibility for a post-scarcity abundance mindset. We have the abundance already, potentially, at least potentially it's there.
Yeah.
We have more than enough air power from wind turbines, geothermal energy, power from like tidal energy and so on. It's more than enough already. Just each of those types of renewable energy is enough to power the Earth by itself. Combining them together would be, so the problem is not the lack of science, lack of technology, lack of innovation. Innovation's fine.
Yeah.
It's the lack of informed activism.
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about. So,
but the students which go out on every Friday, are they informed activists in your
I'd say so, yeah, definitely. In fact, young people, they don't have the hang-ups of past generations, including my generation as well. They don't. A lot of them have that.
12 or so.
Yeah, of course.
They are that's innovation activists.
Yeah, a lot of them are very informed about what's going on. They've read a lot of the reports from the United Nations about climate change, not just the UN, but the University of Washington keeps coming out with these articles. The leading science journals like Nature and Science come out with articles all the time about the seriousness of the crisis.
I think pretty much. Yeah,
the smartest people on our planet are telling you something. When they're doing that, you should listen. It's not a complicated thing, in my opinion. You don't have to be a scientist to understand it. You can just. There's many people that are popularizing the idea, like Peter Wadhams and so on, who popularize the science so that it's accessible for everyone. It's really just about your values, really, at the end of the day. What do you value? Do you value profits, power, resources in the hands of a few people at the top of the society? Do you think that's a rational way to run the society? Or do you think in a society based on equality, peace, respect for the air and the water that you live on and you require? Yeah, it's about your values at the end of the day. Yeah, when enough people value something, then they'll bring about the change automatically, I think.
Yeah, but this system, the second system you talked about, the informed democratic way and everybody has the sources, that only works out if everybody has the information how
it's about information.
Yeah.
This brings me to my second point about democracy.
We're not on this point. We're not on this point today.
I think we are. We're pretty well. A lot of us are well informed about climate change. It's just the question now what to do to change the economic system and the political system. At the end of the day, the reason why the climate change crisis is happening is because the people of the world don't have the control over their governments that's required. We actually don't really control our government in the UK. It's one thing to be able to elect, and I know some people here are sick of me saying this again and again, but it's such an important message. It's one thing to be able to choose what kind of prime minister you have, or choose your president or whatever. And then to have certain human rights, such as the right to free speech, so that you can have a debate in between elections about policy. That's a good step towards democracy. But it's not democratic in itself. Real democracy is when the people directly, face to face, make the decisions about the economy, about the political system, about the culture, about the society. When they do that through local assemblies. And so I'm here today at Speaker's Corner to describe this crisis. I've done that now. And I'm also here to hold out this ideology which I call communalism, direct democracy, face-to-face, local assemblies. So I'm here to, I can't explain all the details of how this ideology works in a few minutes because that would be boring, and I think it's better to just introduce the idea and let you go away and research it if you want to. But the possibility is there, and It really just requires work to put it into action. That's all it requires.
Where did you get your education?
Where did I get my education? I'm getting it right now from all of you. I'm getting it all the time. The word education comes from the Latin word educere, which means to educe or to bring out, to help something unfold out of something else, to develop. I dropped out of university a couple of years ago because I don't believe I really needed it to live a good life.
What was the course?
I was studying history and anthropology, which is two very important subjects to understanding the current crisis. You know, if you understand history, then you understand where you're going and how to preempt obstacles to democracy. Because you can look at the past democratic struggles. For example, there was a lot of people don't know this, it's buried, but there was a directly democratic group of assemblies in Paris during the French Revolution, organized by working people, normal people, at the basic level, making decisions face to face, kind of like what I was talking about. Now, I don't say we should have it just like that, because that was Paris in the 18th century, and a lot of them didn't allow women to take part in the assemblies, and a lot of the assemblies were not, it wasn't in the rest of France, it was only in one city. I would like to see the whole world have it, and I think women should take part as well in these assemblies. Now, this brings me on to this topic of socialism as well. The big reason I see it as to why we have an ecology crisis is because of the contradictions inherent in capitalism. Capitalism, in order to work, requires growth. So if you're a business, if you're a corporation, the only way you're going to survive in the marketplace is by growing and growing. Expanding your number of employees, your market share. The main thing is market share, having as much of the share of that market you're in as possible. Now, to do that growth, you're naturally going to come up against the environment.
Yeah, and
you're going to care more about saving.
Can
I answer the question? Sorry, before I answer the question, can I finish my point?
Okay,
it's better. You can only know the solution when you understand the problem. In fact, if everybody at Speaker's Corner just spoke about the problem, that would be enough. Then we could leave everyone else to talk about their solutions. So, capitalism, it comes up against the environment because it constantly demands cost efficiency. If you're a company, to get that market share, you have to cut costs. You can't be wasting money on things you can, will slow you down in the competition with the other businesses. So you cut costs. So I worked in a hotel in London where they would just dump huge amounts of food in the bin at the end of the day, because it was actually more expensive to transport it down to have it biodegrade and rationally disintegrate. They just dumped it in the bin straight away. Whole barrels of apples, totally irrational way of doing things. And that's just a small aspect of the system. 50% of food that gets produced doesn't reach a human stomach thanks to the capitalist system. This is while hundreds of millions of people are starving on this planet. Hundreds of millions of people, all right? Now, that in itself should tell you all you need to know about the capitalist system. There are other aspects of it which are also important. The relationship with the state as well. Remember, it's the states, such as Britain, France, America, and so on, which use violence to extract resources from poor countries to feed big business and so on. Thinking countries like the Congo, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia is a good example. The mass of the people in Saudi Arabia have no say in the political decision making. And that's because it's easier for the West to extract oil that way. Because if the mass of Saudi Arabian people had a say in policy, then they would try and redistribute that oil wealth to them. And they would make it more democratic. But the West cannot have that. It's just the policy imperative of big businesses. Now I'm going to talk about socialism. Now, my friend here, Pavlo, he speaks often at Speaker's Corner about socialism, and I hate to say this, but I don't think he has a very good understanding of what socialism is.
Oh, no, you didn't.
Oh yeah, I did. Socialism is not just what Chairman Mao did to the people of China, or what Stalin did to the people of Russia. Socialism is far more than that, my friend. Far more than that.
Of course. It's in the heart.
It's a very different.
Where is the heart?
You remind me of
Where is the heart? It's falling down now.
You remind me of there was a cartoon of a young boy in Russia, and then he's looking at a map and he's saying, here is Russia, here is China, and here is communism. Yeah.
Yes, comrade.
Yes. Yeah. Socialism is not when the state runs the society or the state runs the economy, or when the party controls the labor army and impels it to work towards the good of the nation. That's not what socialism is about. Socialism, as it's always been understood by mainstream socialist theorists like Rosa Luxemburg, like Peter Kropotkin, These are people that are there, if you care to look. They are there.
They're anarchists.
They're
anarchists. Can we interject with a few questions? Can you name a socialist country today that you believe has achieved socialism? First point. Second point, you're talking about the failures of capitalism in terms of the ecological crisis. But when you look at communist regimes, i.e. the Soviet regime in the 80s, mass ecological disaster has occurred. So the correlation between socialism and communism and ecology, you know, their record hasn't been great. So just deal with those two questions first.
Okay, so first of all, I don't believe you can have socialism in one country. All right, I believe socialism has to be an international effort by working people.
The world revolution.
By working people. It has to be a worldwide struggle. It can't just be in one isolated place. So I haven't seen a socialist country to date, because since the 1980s there's been a kind of backlash against these ideas, and I don't think it's likely unless people start to educate themselves about the history of socialism, instead of just looking at whatever the average view on it is.
I couldn't agree more. That is why you should study the body count of socialist countries.
Can I answer the question? Yeah. So, now you speak. This actually relates to that. So yeah, I'm aware of what Soviet Russia did to the Aral Sea. They destroyed a whole sea, a gigantic sea, more like an ocean almost. Yeah. Just drained it out to feed cotton plants. I'm aware of what Stalin's regime did. However, the reason I don't call this socialism is because it's not compatible with the original definition of what socialism is. Let me define what I mean by this, okay? Before I go on, I'm not going to go on until I've defined all these isms, and I'll mention the ones you mentioned. Socialism is when the workers control the means of production, or when the working people, right, and their families. It's when they directly control the factories, the offices, the hotels, and all the rest of the economy. That's what it's always been understood as. People like Charles Fourier, Peter Kropotkin, Rosa Luxemburg. This was the mainstream of socialism. All right, that's always been what it's understood. Communism is when you have a stateless, classless, moneyless society based on sharing and production. Right? It's what's sometimes understood as the highest stage of socialism. However, it also has another meaning as well. Communism is just basically whatever state calls itself communist, or whenever a party calling itself Communist Party runs a country. That's the most common understanding of what communism is. When people say that's a communist country, then they usually mean that. They don't mean that Russia is a stateless, moneyless, classless society. They mean that it just has a communist party. So that's the second. Talk about Marxism now as well. Marxism is just the body of Marx's work as it's been filled in by various scholars over the years. Because Marx had he was very productive, but he didn't finish a lot of his work. He kind of left it for other people to finish. So a lot of scholars who picked that up and dealt with it. What's anarchism? Anarchism is the idea that the best way to get to socialism is not through the state. Not through the state. It's through direct assemblies at the grassroots level. Right?
And what's the monarchism? What's the monarchism?
Monarchism. Monarchism. Oh, okay. Monarchism it's the philosophy of, it's kind of like Donald Trump's philosophy. Let's put it that way.
Communism is not like that. It's a planned economic.
All right, Kyle.
But you need to have
if
you're an anarchist,
power is passed hereditarily through monarchy. Donald Trump can't be a monarchist.
If you're an anarchist, you can have a planned economy. You just don't think it should be centrally planned. You think it should be decentralized among the people. Now, there was a famous Ukrainian anarchist called Nestor Makhno who led a huge rebellion against Lenin's policies.
I know.
He's there.
I know.
There are the people who define socialism as whatever Lenin did, or whatever Stalin did, or Mao did. They are, I think, intentionally ignoring people like Nestor Makhno, people like Mikhail Bakunin. They're ignoring the Spanish Revolution, which brought about, temporarily, granted, I'm not saying this is permanent, temporarily a very anarchistic society. They are kind of. And I mean, Noam Chomsky put it really well. He said he explained why is it the word socialism is so confusing for a lot of people. He said what happened was the Soviet Union, not socialist, right, intentionally destroyed socialism. Remember, if we define socialism as working people controlling production, Lenin set out to destroy that as soon as he came into power, dismantling the Soviets, dismantling the factory councils. But he did it in the name of socialism. He said it's to protect socialism, right? And he said, if you read Lenin's words, you can read that. It's better, instead of talking about Lenin, it's sometimes good to read him. He said himself that socialism is nothing but state capitalism made to serve the whole people. That's a very unusual understanding of what socialism is. Most people at the time thought that was very unusual. They saw Lenin as quite right-wing for believing that. Okay. Now, I'll continue with what I'm saying here. Yeah. Now the problem is that that word socialism has been identified with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union did it for propaganda because they knew it had a very moral appeal and they wanted to make their regime look good for the world. America did that, and Britain defined it as socialism because they wanted to take that good idea and make it look terrible by associating it with the totalitarian dungeon that was Russia. All right? That's what they did. And it's like Noam Chomsky says, it's very, very accurate. When two of the biggest propaganda systems on the planet agree on something, it's very difficult for your brain to get out of that. It is hard. It takes time to... I myself, I didn't want to call myself a socialist for a long time because I didn't want to be associated with the ideas of people like Marx, you know, for example. And Marx had an authoritarian streak in himself as well. There's no use hiding it. Nothing like Stalin, I don't think at all. Marx would have been disgusted at what Stalin created. I think he would have been rather disgusted at what Lenin created as well. Now, getting back to your thing about ecology, with that in mind, yes, you could possibly have a democratic control over production by the people. Direct control over not through the state, but through the people, through face-to-face assemblies at the grassroots level. You could have that and you could still have destruction of the environment. Yes, I agree. Yeah. So it's not necessarily going to create an ecological outcome. However, I think the average person cares far more about their environment, about the parks that they walk around in, about the animals they spend time with. I think they care far more about that than the elite, who have a lot to profit from destruction of the atmosphere, destruction of animal life, destruction of human life. When Bangladesh is underwater because of climate change, that's not going to benefit the people of Bangladesh. It's not going to benefit the people of Britain either.
Kyle.
It's going to benefit certain elites who've going to make money out of it.
Let him respond.
Can I interject on a subject that's sort of covering the ecological aspect and the economic aspect simultaneously?
Sorry? Yes, I got
something
you.
that's going to cover both the economics and the ecology. Have any of you guys heard of something called Merton's Law?
Yeah, I have actually.
Tragedy of the commons. Do those words come up a lot? So Merton's Law was come up by a trader. I think his name was Andrew Merton.
No. Get up on the ladder, and then everyone can see you.
Oh dear.
I wanted to.
We need someone to translate his English.
I wanted
English
to
is fine.
respond. I wanted to respond to you, but now.
Listen to this.
All right.
Tomato
So
and potato.
Merton's Law Merton was a trader in the late 19th century of the United Kingdom, and he uncovered that very specific practices made some traders more successful than others. That is, traders who cheated or were fundamentally immoral were fundamentally more successful than other traders who were behaving in a more moral style. So in a sense, the advantage would go to someone who behaves in a negative fashion. Like, say, a banker that doesn't take risk and make much more money is more likely to become the norm versus a banker who does take a lot of risks and potentially loses money. It's not a testament of skill. And that goes down to the tragedy of the commons approach, in that someone who has a much more competitive streak and is willing to abuse the ecology far more effectively than someone who is more moderate with their environment will be more financially successful. So the idea is to sort of come with regulation as to you cannot abuse your environment beyond a certain point, and we all have to stop at a certain limit, which is kind of tantamount to your point, which is if there's a central authority or some overarching thing that says, no, you can only stop here, you can't go beyond that, which is one of the faults of unregulated or unmitigated capitalism, as you put it.
Yeah, but here's a key point, and this is what you were arguing. So you gave all the definitions of all the isms. You talked about socialism, anarchism, and all the rest. And you said, the weird question today is there's never been a socialist country. A very, very radical statement from you. You're basically saying the theory which you believe in, all of the attempts which have been tried, they've never even come close to it. Now, but basically, I think the issue, I don't really want to be on camera, to be honest.
Neither do I, but
the issue you've got is that your ideological purity is so massive that you can't even see that all the attempts to get to socialism, communism, Mao, Lenin, all those problems which you described, they manifested themselves in the deaths of millions of people.
Exactly.
Point two, you're talking about there's a bad incentive in capitalism.
Not just capitalism.
Where it favours those who effectively pollute the environment so they can profit more. So the solution, therefore, is not necessarily to go all the way to socialism. is to get, as you say, regulated capitalism.
That's kind of the second point I was getting to, and thanks. That's a great segue, by the way. What I wanted to add, so to your conversation, is that capitalism, socialism, communism, when you distill them down to their most basic components, are means of distribution of materials and property. That is what. Take away all the politics. That's exactly what it is. Capitalism is about exchange based on capital. Socialism is exchange based on means of production and control. Communism.
It tries to transcend exchange.
But it's about how you.
Yeah, it's not exchange. It's taking away everything and giving back the absolute minimum.
But bear with me. But in that sense, you're absolutely right. Any system that is taken to a point without regulation, without modification, without sort of negative feedback loops coming in, will eat itself, regardless of whether it's capitalistic, socialistic, or communistic. So back to you. Thank you.
All right, Kyle. I'll ask you the question that I always ask.
Can I answer his question first?
Okay, go ahead.
Again, I'm here every Sunday. I'll see you next Sunday. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Actually, can I keep this book? It's my friend just gave it to me. Oh, take a photo of it then. Yeah.
David,
No. Oh, sorry.
Don't do drugs, kids. Don't do drugs.
You can write down the name
It's not
of it.
worth it.
So, sorry, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry.
Does tea count?
Again, I have to be very. I have to repeat myself again. It's hard because, again, the propaganda is so powerful.
Propaganda.
Not saying your propaganda. No, I never said that at all. Again, I don't think Lenin was a socialist. I really don't think that he was. I don't think he was trying to create it. If you look at it, you don't. Sorry, guys, do you mind? If you shouldn't judge a statesman by what he says he's going to do, or what he says he believes. You should judge it by what he actually does. And Lenin did everything he could to dismantle socialism in Russia. So if you looked at Russia before the revolution, before the October coup d'état against the government, there was a whole range of factory councils going across Petrograd, across Moscow, where workers would elect their representatives, and it was very close to what real socialism is about. If you define socialism as the basic idea that the community should run production, the community should decide distribution, and by community you don't mean a centralized government, a state. I mean really the basic definition is the people, right, and the workers and so on. So Lenin did everything he could to undermine that. When he got into power, he dismantled those Soviets, dismantled those factory councils, and he brought about, he laid the groundwork for Stalin very much. So I don't think it's fair to say that Lenin was trying to create socialism. Chairman Mao was, again, trying to use the appeal of socialism to the average person in China to launch a kind of super modern, high-speed modernization of China, right? To bring it out of a situation where I think less than, was it 90% of people in China earning less than £1 every day? Something like that. He was trying to modernize it very quickly. And yeah, you could do whatever you want in the name of an idea and at the same time contradict that idea. You can do that all the time. And it's proven all the time. Look at the Catholic Church, for example. In the name of an ideology which is about peace and about respect for humankind and love, they've sacked Jerusalem and they've destroyed, countless lives in Spain during the Spanish Inquisition. I mean, it wasn't a peaceful institution, although it had a very peaceful ideology.
Okay, so you're comparing socialism to a religion.
Now, to get back to your point about ideology, when I said there hasn't been a socialist country, in the sense that there hasn't been a country that's had widespread control of the economy by the people, not by the state, not by big business, by the people, through factory councils or whatever. When I said that doesn't negate socialism. All right, you can have. Here's an analogy, for example. When the suffragettes were in England and they were chaining themselves to the railings over here and outside Downing Street in the name of feminism, they didn't really use the word feminism because that came later, but that was the idea. They had only one ideal. They had only one group of people that had carried out the ideal to the fullest extent, and that was in New Zealand. Women in New Zealand had gotten the vote. Now, just because New Zealand was the only place to do that, that doesn't negate the idea of feminism. It's still a good idea, just because even if only the New Zealanders had created the vote for women, it's still a good idea, and it was still worth struggling for in Britain.
Not third wave
feminism. And I think all the women in the audience
though.
should remember that.
Not third wave.
If they're from the United Kingdom, that their right to vote doesn't come on the back of it's just not automatic. It came from struggle, popular struggle at the grassroots. Yes, there was certain leaders like Emily Pankhurst and all the rest, but it was really the mass of women who was struggling for this, right? And it will be the same for socialism as well. The idea will have to come from it'll have to be carried out by the mass of ordinary people, who want to take control over their lives, take control over their economic production, to have a say in how their workplaces are run. That's real socialism. That's what it's always been understood as. Just another way of saying workplace democracy. But like, it's very hard for a lot of people who've lived in this propaganda system for so long. No, it's true. I was like this myself as well.
But honestly,
they associate socialism so much with the Soviet Union that they can't see that this is just a propaganda trick to try and defame a very good idea by associating it with something totalitarian and nightmarish and horrible to live under. It should be transparently obvious to anybody who's had a look at the history of Russia. But
it would be easier to trust socialism if there would be more example of socialism
Did
succeeding.
you not hear what I just said? I just said you don't judge an idea. Let me put it in a pithy statement.
So how do you judge an idea?
You don't judge an idea by how well it's been attempted to be put into practice. You judge it by its internal logical coherence. So feminism,
if the internal logical coherence doesn't apply to the real world, you can't judge
I
it.
gave you the example of feminism.
Here's the key point.
Feminism was a good idea,
Here's
even
the
if
key point.
even if it had never been tried in any country except for New Zealand. Feminism was still a very good idea, and
It's
the
not
women
now.
of Britain understood that. At least a good amount of them did.
At least
that.
not in the West.
All right, it doesn't.
You're engaging
You
in
judge,
a monologue.
you judge an idea.
You're just giving a monologue.
You judge
it's not a dialogue.
You judge an ism
Yeah,
or an
exactly.
idea or an ideology.
Can you start with the monologue?
Okay.
It's the speaker's corner.
With
It's
the
not-
dialogue.
it's not
Yeah,
audience's
but it's
corner,
become
sorry.
you cult of personality. You just deliver the whole speech.
Socialism. Socialism.
My friend, this is not a conversation between
one?
you and me. This is a
Which one?
speaker
Yeah,
speaking
it
to a
is.
large audience. And if
you're
you'd like
the-
to be that speaker,
You're the
you're more than welcome
propagandist.
to.
You're the
You're more
propagandist.
than welcome to get on my ladder and speak to the audience. But I'm not here just
Go
to
ahead,
speak to
bro,
you.
go
Sorry.
ahead.
2 points, Hack.
What's your question?
2 points.
You've already answered all the questions. What's
2
your
points.
question?
Yeah, dodge it. Dodge it.
Yeah, I've let you ask 5 questions.
Dodge it. Let him
What's your
speak.
question?
Let him speak.
What a surprise. What a surprise. Nah, he's a good guy. He's a good guy. It's just that he's a bit, socialist. He's just a bit socialist.
Thank you so much for this question. I do not come to Speaker's Corner primarily to speak about socialism, although I am a socialist. Not my main interest.
Whoa, this is some news.
My main interest when I come to Speaker's Corner, and I'll tell you this, I've been coming to this place for 3-4 years now. My name is Kyle Farron, I'm 22, and I've come here for 3-4 years now. Primarily to speak about to ask the question to the British people, what is the UK's role in the world? What is our role in the world? Are we a force for good? Or are we not such a benevolent force as our leaders like to make out? Now, this gentleman just asked me a question. I'll repeat it because he asked it very quietly. The question is, what is the UK's stance towards radical Islam? Very, very, very good question, my friend. Before I continue, I'd like to say that what I'm about to say is very based on a book by a British author called Mark Curtis, who wrote a fantastic, this book is called Secret Affairs, Britain's Collusion with Radical Islam. I saw it being sold in Waterstones. It's not just a book, any old book. You can buy it on Amazon. It's in the shops. It's not a crazy book. And he bases his information on the Foreign Office, declassified files from our Foreign Office in London. And he finds out there's a very striking relationship between the British elite and the radical Islamic movement. Not just terrorist groups at the local level, but whole governments like Saudi Arabia, which are terrorist
It's
governments.
not striking at all. The British allowed the Saudis to take
Incredibly
power.
striking. It's very interesting for a government which claims to be in favor of peace, human rights, religious tolerance, international law. It's very striking that for so long they've collaborated and worked with so many radical Islamic entities on this planet so thoroughly. And again, not just Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, although that's very significant in itself. Not just them, but very specific groups. For example, not many people know this, but Al-Qaeda in Arabic means the base, and that's referring to a database given to Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 80s by MI5 and the CIA, a database which had the name of potential recruits for their cause. This is back at a time in the 80s when Britain was trying to help the local radical Muslim population kick out the Soviets from Afghanistan, who had occupied Afghanistan in a brutal occupation.
So radicals against radicals.
What Britain was trying to do was create a marriage of convenience. All right, this is what MI6 have been doing for a long time. Marriage convenience with certain radical Islamic groups which are useful for their aims. In the short term, they get their aims met. They know in the long term a lot of these guys could turn back and hurt them. And they have done that. The guy who bombed the Manchester bomber, Salman Abdi, he was part of a terrorist group that was trained up, not funded, but it was being trained up by basically Britain in Libya. It's called the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. Him and his father, Ramadan Abdi,
Ramadan.
No, was it Ramadan?
His name is Ramadan.
I can't remember his first name. But he was, this man went to Libya. He was allowed safe passage to go there to help bring down Gaddafi. Again, short-term aim of the British elite, bring down Gaddafi. This is a guy who's standing in the way of the British imperative in that country, just to make sure that we have access to their oil. Gaddafi was standing in the way of that, so we had to get rid of him. And so they got radical Islamic insurgents on the ground. They collaborated with him to do that. And Salman Abdi was one of those men. He was British, but he went there and they allowed him to go there so he could do that. The thing is, they didn't really think in the long term what might happen about this. They didn't think that maybe that this gentleman might come back and maybe blow up British people. He might use his skills that he gained in the Middle East to come back and hurt British people. And that's exactly what happened. And you know, I tell you, it angers me so much when I see speakers at Speaker's Corner talking about Muslims being a bad influence on people in Britain. And they don't have a look at what Britain has done to champion radical Islam in the Middle East. They're almost intentionally ignorant of that whole history. And it's not just Libya, and it's not just Al-Qaeda. Saudi Arabia, we should just talk about, Saudi Arabia by itself is enough to talk about. It was revealed by WikiLeaks that Hillary Clinton was very well aware that Saudi Arabia was funding ISIS. Not private citizens within the kingdom, but the actual government was funding ISIS.
True.
I mean, that's not a big surprise because Saudi Arabia and ISIS are not that different. I mean, Saudi Arabia beheads its own citizens all the time, right? So it's not much of a...
Do you have any proof?
Do I have any proof?
Yeah.
Well, Hillary Clinton was well... You can read the WikiLeaks email that was leaked from Hillary Clinton's office. She was well aware of it.
There are countless of other proofs that the CIA were involved as well.
The CIA were involved in what? Sorry, what are you talking about?
Al-Qaeda, in ISIS.
Well, I don't know if you heard me, I just spoke about that.
The WikiLeaks email speak about it.
Yeah. Before you came, I was speaking about CIA's role in creating Al-Qaeda. If you're interested more about that, there's a book by an American author called John Cooley. It's called Unholy Wars, and it's about CIA's role in creating Al-Qaeda. MI6 were also involved in that as well.
That's right.
Quite often everyone talks about the CIA role, but they don't often bring up British intelligence agencies and what they've done as well to foster radical Islam as a kind of a short-term, you know, energy to mobilize against enemies like Russia or Gaddafi or whatever.
Not because of that.
It's not because they agree with radical Islam. It's because they're very useful.
Because they always plan to penetrate through the central government and control the oil. That's one
of course.
their aims.
I mean, if you're a Western elite, a big business in the West, what would you rather have? Would you rather have the Middle East have democratic government and control of its oil? Or would you rather make sure that you can access that oil without interference from the public? I mean, again, something Britain and America should know very well about. In the 1950s, there was a democratically elected leader of Iran called Mohammad Mossadegh. And Mohammad Mossadegh was a secular Arab nationalist, something that people have forgotten that ever existed. They forget that in the Arab world, there was a huge movement which wanted to create a united Arabia on a secular basis.
But he was a communist.
He was not a communist,
Yes.
he was a nationalist.
No,
he was a nationalist.
He was a communist, and he was
Where do you have
supported by
where's the
the
evidence?
Russians
Where do you have the
to
evidence
control
for
the oil, and that's why BP and the British Petroleum on the south tried to get rid of him and replace him with the king.
Even if that was true, I don't know if that's true.
Well,
but
listen, you're
even if
radical
that-
Islam.
Even if
In
that
your
was
book,
true.
Radical Islam, Mark Curtis has said that. You
Okay,
said earlier,
you did
you
that.
said
You said that. Okay.
Radical Islam.
All right.
Remember?
I forgot about that part. But even if that's true, that doesn't justify launching a coup d'état against the government. That's what they did in 1953. I think the date was. I think Winston Churchill said he really wished he could have taken part in this adventure. He said, MI6 and the CIA.
Callahan was there.
They brought down the democratic elected leader of Iran, and they replaced him with the Shah of Iran, a sort of radical Shia cleric, and they created
cleric, pro-West.
But he was pro-West. That's the most important thing. Britain doesn't care about your
pro-West,
whether you're a dictator.
It's the name.
It's as long as you're allowing safe access to oil, and that's what BP has today. And you know, they call themselves British Petroleum, but there's nothing British about it. I'm sorry, they're not. It's really, their first allegiance is not to the British people. It's to this, all right? It's to that. It's the money. That's what they care about. And if it means Iranians getting killed in a coup d'état, which is what happened, then that's fine. Then that's fine. They don't care. So I tell you all of this not to make you feel bad about this country that you're standing in. I think it's a great country. It's got a lot of potential. It's just so we know a little bit better about how the world really works. And then we can act better to introduce the kind of system that we believe is fair and just. In my case, I believe in communalism.
But this
I believe in communalism, which is a specific kind of socialism, which is there, again, if you care to look at it, it's there to, you know, there are other kinds of socialism which are not authoritarian. There's a whole libertarian socialist tradition going back to the 18th century in Britain, or 17th century.
They wanted to show their own local Muslims that they're doing some work for them. That's why they always promoted the radical Islam. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, of course. Again, radical Islam is seen by the elite as a useful tool when it's needed.
Yeah.
All right. You know, like for a lot of people don't know this, but you know the London bombing, right? Back in 2004. Most of those men who were doing that were of Pakistani origin, and they went to Pakistan to train up to do that bombing in a very remote part of Pakistan. This was under the watch of the Pakistani government. They knew that was going on. They knew there was people training up to be terrorists, right? And jihadis and so on. They knew that was going on. Gordon Brown knew that was going on. Gordon Brown was happy to relate to Pakistan, and he didn't put any pressure on them to clamp down on this. He didn't put any pressure at all. That, in my opinion, you may disagree with me on this, everyone standing here, but in my opinion, that makes Gordon Brown complicit in the 2004 bombing. If he knew that Pakistan was doing all of this,
the same thing,
and he didn't do anything about it, he just let it happen, then that makes it.
Did the same with Al-Haq. Margaret Thatcher.
Now, I'll tell you something else. This gentleman probably already knows because he's read the book I'm talking about, Secret Affairs by Mark Curtis. But there's a I found this very interesting as someone who lives in London. There's a very interesting chapter in that book called Londonistan.
Yes.
For me, it was the most unbelievable chapter I ever read in the whole book. That book for me is full of revelations based on declassified files from the Foreign Office, but that one for me was astounding. So the chapter is called Londonistan. Now, Londonistan was a jokey word that MI6 used to call London. And the reason why they called this word... The reason why they called it was not...
Zionist.
Can I answer the question? Sorry. The reason why they called London Londonistan has nothing to do with any racism or you know, they weren't making any comments about immigrants. It was because there was so many radical Islamic groups set up in London, which they allowed to be set up in London. I mean, Scotland Yard had a deal. It was called what they called a covenant of security. This is what they called it. They said, yes, you can set up your radical Islamic headquarters in London as long as you don't attack Londoners, as long as you don't attack Britain. We will allow you to set up your headquarters in London, and you can bomb the rest of the world. You can bomb Bosnia or wherever it is you want to do. Just don't attack Britain. As long as no blood is spilled on the British streets, right? That was the idea. One of these groups was a very interesting organization called the Advice and Reformation Committee. This was an organization set up by Osama bin Laden as a front for Al-Qaeda, as a kind of acceptable looking front, yeah? Now, this is amazing that this was allowed to be set up, that Scotland Yard knew that these kind of groups were being set up. Jama'at al-Islam was another terrorist group as well that was set up here as well. They allowed it to happen. It was only when 2001 happened, the 2001 attack in America, only then did Tony Blair say, okay, now we need to clamp down on these groups. But right up until that point, that's essentially a green light to terrorism.
Is that declassified?
Yeah, that's all based on declassified information. I am not interested in conspiracy theories. I'm really not. What I'm interested in is where the elite have actually allowed us information, and they have done it. You can read the declassified files. You yourself, if you live in London, it's a great opportunity to go. You can go to the National Archives and you can read what the elite have said themselves, what they believe themselves. You know, you get it from the horse's mouth. You can find out their views on radical Islam and so on. I mean, it's not just Saudi Arabia, it's not just Pakistan, and it's not just allowing terrorists to set up in London as well. There's a whole other list of examples in that book. I mean, for example, the role of Britain basically in the creation of Pakistan. Yeah. The role of Britain in helping the Muslim Brotherhood come to power in Egypt. The role of Britain in, for example, there's just so many, I can't even start.
You're operating under the belief that everything that's been released as declassified is necessarily true.
Not necessarily true.
That in itself could be part of social engineering.
Not necessarily true, but it gives you a good insight into what. Yeah, it does give you a good insight into what's happening and who's pulling the strings and what's going on. It does.
Thank you.
My friend, thank you very much. Yeah. In fact, I appreciate if you come back and speak about.
See you next week.
Yeah, of course. I'm here every week, by the way. If anyone wants to ask questions, I'm always here every week. Can I say your question and then your question as well? Thank you.
Something a bit more interesting. Why is that? I'm assuming you're a feminist. Why is feminism necessary?
Oh, I'm a huge feminist. Yeah. And by feminism, I mean the very simple, normal definition of feminism, which is that men and women should have equal human rights. For me, it's something that shouldn't even be discussed anymore in Britain. It should be just a no-brainer. It shouldn't be on the agenda. However, feminism is also an idea which has been abused as well, big time.
By feminists.
Not just by people calling themselves feminists, but by certain men who still have not caught up to the changes that started in the 1970s with the second wave of feminism. Men who are still having an irrational response and can't emotionally deal with the idea that women should have equal rights to them. But I think a lot of women are part of the problem as well. I mean, I've been reading this book. I was going to tell my friend about it. I don't know where he is, but I was going to have a chat to him about it. Is he over there? Somewhere around. Anyway, the book is called The Masculine Century, and this book is very interesting.
Would you agree that capitalism is patriarchal?
I'll get to that, but let me just answer the question about feminism, right? Restate the question again so I can tell everybody what it is.
Why do you? I assume you're a feminist.
Why am I a feminist? Yes. Why am I a feminist? It's because I love the feminine aspect of life. And I think men should become more feminine, and I think women should go back to being feminine, because a lot of women have just abandoned femininity as some kind of weakness. They see it as a weakness. But I think it's high time that men started to get in touch with their feminine side and learn to appreciate the softer, more aesthetic, more gentle, more cooperative way of being. This is how Europe used to, the European aristocracy used to believe this. For hundreds of years, they had this attitude that it was okay to be feminine. There's nothing wrong with showing your emotions. It was only during World War II and World War I, it was only the experience of the American and the Australian frontier that Europe started to become more masculine, more violent, more aggressive. You know,
it's my problem with feminism.
And you know, the sad thing is to say this, to get up and say this at Speaker's Corner, straight away people will think you're gay if you say this kind of thing. I'm not gay. I'm happy to say I'm not. I have no interest in having sex with men. It's sad that the only men who are saying this are gay men. The only men who are calling for more femininity in the world of men are gay at the moment. It shouldn't be that way. I think it's time straight men started to talk about this as well. We don't have to be super masculine all the time. So I've already answered your question, but
can I cancel that?
Yeah, okay, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Well, feminism relies on this neo-Marxist principle that a patriarchy, that Western society is a tyrannical patriarchy, which is certainly not true. If you'd like to
that's not what feminism is about. I'm not going to.
Third wave feminism is.
Yeah, that's what third wave feminism is.
Again, this is part of the irrational response to feminism.
There you go. There you go.
What you
Let's
said.
debate about it.
You take one aspect, one particular brand of feminism.
Aspect. That's how most feminists are. That's why feminism has a bad reputation nowadays, because they're very irrational, very emotional, and they don't have any arguments. Yeah. So that's the thing.
I'm not interested in having debate.
Well, you're not interested.
Sorry, my friend.
From man, say it straight. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV. Listen.
Can I film?
That's all right. You all okay with that?
Some scholars suggest that the Yemeni king who rules both the Bab al-Mandab, northern part of the Horn of Africa.
If you need a break, I can carry your.
You better come from that side.
I can carry your camera again.
Want me out of the video?